Perhaps this film will save someone's life. The girl had returned from school and was alone for just a few minutes. When her parents came home, there was no trace of her. Police officers and volunteers searched for her for several weeks, yet it seemed as though she had vanished into thin air. Suddenly, there was an unexpected twist in the case, which triggered a series of events that shook the country. Ultimately, it became one of the most high-profile and controversial cases in Canadian history, and it remains so to this day. The case of Christine Jessup. Christine Jessup was born on the 29th of November, 1974, in the small Canadian town of Queensville. This quiet and peaceful place, located near a picturesque lake, had only about 600 residents, all of whom knew each other personally. Christine lived there with her parents and her brother, who was 5 years older. She loved spending time outdoors, riding her bike and playing baseball, a sport she grew fond of thanks to her brother. Besides that, the girl had a great love for animals, and one day, when a bat flew into her room, she not only didn't get scared but actually wanted to keep it as a pet. On the 3rd of October, 1984, when Christine was 9 years old, she got up early in the morning as usual and began getting ready for school. Her brother was complaining of severe tooth pain, so their mother planned to take him to the dentist. Because of this, Christine was supposed to stay home alone after school until they returned. Despite her young age, it wasn't the first time Christine had been left without supervision, and her parents weren't worried that anything could happen to her. She was very independent and knew how to take care of herself. Before leaving school that day, Christine arranged with her best friend that they would meet up after returning home. She boarded the school bus, which dropped her off a few hundred meters from her house. At the agreed-upon time, her friend went to the park where they had planned to meet and began waiting for her. Time passed, but Christine didn't show up. The girl waited a little longer and then went home, trying to call Christine. However, no one answered. Meanwhile, Christine's mother and brother returned home. The woman immediately noticed that her daughter wasn't inside. It was clear that Christine had returned from school because her backpack was in her room, and the mail had been taken from the mailbox and placed in the hallway. However, some details worried her mother. First, Christine's bike was lying outside the house with its kickstand bent. Christine took great care of her bike, so her mother was surprised that she would have just left it outside. Second, Christine's jacket was hanging in the hallway on the highest hook, which the girl couldn't reach by herself. Even so, at first, her mother didn't see a reason to worry. She assumed that Christine had simply gone out to play as she often did and began waiting for her. After about an hour, when it started to get dark, she began to worry. Although her daughter was independent and often spent time outdoors, she always informed her mother where she was going. The mother started calling the parents of Christine's friends, hoping that her daughter was playing with one of them. However, every time she asked, she heard the same answer: no one had seen her after school. When she called her daughter's best friend, the girl confirmed that they were supposed to meet at the park, but Christine never showed up. When it turned out that none of her friends had seen her, the woman and her son set out to search for her. Given the small size of their town, they quickly checked all the places Christine liked to visit, but she was nowhere to be found. She hadn't returned home either, so around 7 o'clock in the evening, her mother decided to notify the police. For the local officers, this type of case was nothing unusual. It usually involved children who either lost track of time while playing or had an argument with their parents and decided to run away from home. In such situations, they were usually found quickly without the need for an extensive investigation. This time, however, a search was organized, and residents of the town were asked to help. The townspeople immediately joined in the search for the girl. The police established that Christine had entered a small store located between her home and the park where she was supposed to meet her friend. The girl had bought some chewing gum, but what happened to her afterward remained a mystery. At that time, there were no surveillance cameras in the area, which significantly hindered the effort to determine the exact timeline of events. According to their findings, the girl had gone to the store just a few minutes after returning home from school. The search continued late into the night, but Christine was not found. The next day, even more people took to the streets to look for her, and the police began receiving various tips. Unfortunately, none of them proved useful. Most of the reports mentioned seeing a girl on the street or in a passing car, but no one could confirm that it was Christine. Moreover, no one was able to provide any additional details. In the following days, the police began leaning toward the theory that an abduction may have occurred. It seemed unlikely that Christine could remain unnoticed when all the townspeople were aware of her disappearance. Christine's mother was also convinced that her daughter would never have run away from home. Despite this, the officers still couldn't find any clues that could lead them to the child. They searched her home, but the investigation was conducted very poorly due to their lack of experience. Some items were examined superficially, and fingerprints were not secured. Furthermore, before the police carried out a proper inspection, dozens of neighbors and friends had visited the Jessup family home, potentially contaminating any evidence. It's worth noting that at the time of the girl's disappearance, her father was in prison. A few weeks earlier, he had been sentenced to a short term for a minor fraud offense. On the day Christine disappeared, her mother and brother had visited him after their trip to the dentist. When it became clear that the girl had most likely been abducted, her father was released from prison so that he could be with his family, and he immediately joined the search for his daughter. The search continued for several weeks, but neither Christine nor any clues explaining her disappearance were found. The search area gradually expanded, covering nearby fields and forests, but unfortunately, there were still no results. 3 months passed until the 31st of December. While everyone else was preparing to welcome the new year, Christine's family had no reason to celebrate. They still hoped to find the girl alive, but with each passing day, their faith was fading. On that day, a man from the town of Sunderland, located about 35 miles from Queensville, went out to search for his missing dog. While walking through a remote, wooded area behind his home, he noticed something that looked like a pile of trash. As he approached, to his horror, he discovered a human body. He immediately returned home to call the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they quickly identified the victim despite the advanced state of decomposition. Next to the body, they found a small cassette recorder with a sticker bearing the name, Christine Jessup. It was the recorder the girl had received at school on the day she went missing. The police also noted that the victim had most likely suffered violence. Several pieces of clothing, including pants and underwear, were found beside the body, while the upper part of her clothing had not been removed. The body was handed over to forensic specialists, and the police in Queensville classified the case as a homicide. Christine's body showed numerous stab wounds, which were determined to be the cause of her death, along with several abrasions. Experts concluded that the victim had been attacked, and foreign biological material was found on her underwear. At the time, however, DNA analysis was not commonly used, so this evidence couldn't help identify the perpetrator. Investigators believed that the girl had been murdered in a different location and that her body had later been transported to the forest. They were intrigued as to why the killer had traveled nearly 37 miles to leave the body near another town, considering the vast fields and forests surrounding Queensville. Suspecting that the perpetrator might have been connected to Sunderland in some way, detectives believed that the person had chosen this spot because they were familiar with it. At the same time, they were almost certain that the individual lived in Queensville and knew Christine, since everything suggested that the girl may have willingly gone with them or gotten into their car. The police repeatedly asked the victim's parents if they had anyone suspicious in mind. However, Christine's mother always insisted that she couldn't recall anyone who seemed suspicious. Officers interviewed nearly all the town's residents and investigated several individuals with criminal backgrounds or those mentioned in various reports, but none of them could be linked to the crime. The situation changed on the 14th of February when detectives visited the victim's mother once again. They asked her once more to think carefully about whether anyone in her surroundings seemed suspicious. This time, the woman remembered something unusual. In the neighborhood lived the Morin family, who were well respected in the town. The head of the family ran a small business and was known for being able to fix almost anything. The people of Queensville often turned to him for help, which contributed to his good reputation. The man had 6 adult children who supported him in running the business. One of them was 25-year-old Paul Morin, who still lived with his parents. Christine's mother recalled a few strange things about him. First, after her daughter went missing, Paul never participated in the search efforts, even though nearly the entire community joined in over the following weeks. Second, when Christine's body was found, Paul didn't attend her funeral, which had gathered hundreds of people. The woman added that Paul was rather quiet and withdrawn. He had a few friends and a girlfriend, but unlike the rest of his family, he kept to himself. He was interested in playing the clarinet, a detail that caught the detective's attention since Christine had her cassette recorder with her at the time of her disappearance. Investigators suspected that Paul might have used music as a way to start a conversation with Christine and convince her to go with him. Christine must have known him since he had lived just a few yards from her house all his life. Detectives went to speak with Paul and asked him how well he knew the victim. Paul stated that they rarely spoke, apart from one occasion when Christine's dog had run away, and he had helped her catch it. When asked where he was on the day Christine went missing, Paul claimed that he had been working about 35 miles from town until roughly 3:30 in the afternoon. He said that afterward, he went shopping, refueled his car, and returned home around 5 o'clock. Finally, the detectives asked Paul what he thought of Christine. Paul replied that she was just a typical, nice child. However, he then added a rather odd remark, but sometimes they grow up to be rotten. This statement struck the officers as highly suspicious, so they decided to investigate his alibi more thoroughly. They obtained a time card from Paul's workplace. Detectives discovered that Paul had finished his shift that day precisely at 3:32 in the afternoon. Even if he had driven straight home, he wouldn't have arrived before Christine's mother returned. Further verification confirmed that Paul had indeed visited a store and a gas station, which took him about half an hour. Paul's relatives testified that he returned home around 5 o'clock and almost immediately went to sleep, exhausted after work. Based on this, it seemed unlikely that he had enough time to abduct Christine. However, investigators considered the possibility that his family might have been mistaken about the time of his return or could have been covering for him intentionally. Detectives requested permission to search Paul's car. In the trunk, they found several fabric fibers, which were sent for analysis. The results revealed that they matched the material from the sweater Christine had been wearing on the day she disappeared. Additionally, a few hairs found on the victim's body were believed by experts to possibly belong to Paul, although there was no absolute confirmation. At that time, forensic technology only allowed for visual hair sample comparisons to assess whether they appeared similar or distinctly different, for example, in color. Eventually, the police sought help from an FBI profiler, who analyzed the available information about the crime and created a profile of the likely perpetrator. According to the profile, the suspect was a man from Queensville, between the ages of 19 and 26, with a prior criminal record for offenses such as arson or voyeurism. The profiler also described other traits, but detectives focused mainly on those that seemed to match Paul. Although Paul had no criminal record or bad reputation, he fit less than half of the criteria. Nonetheless, the police were convinced that he was the murderer, and on the 22nd of April, they decided to arrest him. Paul denied any involvement, yet he was placed in custody awaiting trial. Christine's parents were shocked that their closest neighbor could have committed such a crime. For detectives, the biggest challenge remained Christine's mother's testimony. She had stated with certainty that she had returned home at 10 minutes past 4. She was sure of this because she had immediately looked at the kitchen clock. Investigators calculated that Paul couldn't have reached her home before 4:10, and abducting Christine would have required at least 15 to 20 additional minutes. Because of this, they repeatedly asked the woman if she was absolutely certain about the time. They insisted that Paul was the killer, but her testimony made it difficult to press charges. Eventually, Christine's mother admitted that she might have returned home a little later, which was enough for the police to proceed with the case. During the trial, the prosecution worked to portray Paul as an odd loner who made the townspeople uneasy. They argued that he had enough time to abduct Christine since her mother had returned home later than she had initially claimed. Regarding Paul's alibi, a psychologist brought in by the prosecution stated that Paul's entire family showed signs of hiding the truth and deliberately protecting him from responsibility. A key moment in the trial came when an undercover officer, who had been placed in Paul's cell while he awaited trial, testified. According to the officer, Paul had mentioned specific details about the crime, including the cause of the victim's death. However, these details had already been published in newspapers, meaning Paul hadn't revealed anything new. Additionally, Paul reportedly talked about how his favorite film was The Shining and even quoted lines from the movie in response to his cellmates' questions. Even though Paul consistently maintained his innocence, the undercover officer's testimony had a significant impact on the trial. Combined with the prosecution's efforts to portray Paul as a strange and potentially dangerous person, this only reinforced the negative image of the accused. Nevertheless, the main focus remained on the evidence, and that evidence still seemed questionable. Ultimately, the jury concluded that it was insufficient for a conviction, and Paul was acquitted and released from the courtroom. The prosecution immediately announced plans to appeal, emphasizing their firm belief in Paul's guilt. For Christine's family, it was yet another blow. They now had to continue living next door to the man accused of murdering their daughter. Her father stated that their lives had been hell since the tragedy, and now that hell would continue. The residents of Queensville were also dissatisfied with the verdict. They believed Paul was the murderer and didn't want him in their community. After his return home, the Morin family began receiving anonymous threats in their mailbox, and their house was pelted with various objects. Meanwhile, the prosecution prepared their appeal, arguing that during the first trial, the judge had failed to provide the jury with a clear explanation of the term "beyond a reasonable doubt." This was enough for the higher court to order a retrial, which began in 1991, several years after the murder. During the preparations for the retrial, several alarming facts came to light. It turned out that the expert who had claimed the fibers from Paul's car matched the material from Christine's sweater had conducted tests on an identical sweater made of the same material and color. However, much of the documentation from these analyses had gone missing, along with the fabric samples and several hairs found on the victim's body and clothing. Moreover, some of Christine's bones and a cigarette butt discovered near her body had also disappeared. Notably, the cigarette butt had never been included in the case files, possibly because Paul had never smoked. Despite these controversies, the trial proceeded. This time, the prosecution presented a new theory, claiming that Paul had noticed Christine's cassette recorder and then pulled out his instrument and started playing. Fascinated by the sound, the girl allegedly approached his car, after which Paul forced her inside, drove her to an unknown location, and murdered her. Although this hypothesis seemed rather far-fetched, in July 1992, the jury unanimously found Paul guilty of murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment. Following the second trial, however, the media narrative began to shift. During the first proceedings, the press had portrayed Paul as a dangerous loner. But now, after numerous investigative errors had come to light, there were growing suggestions that Paul might have been innocent and had fallen victim to gross incompetence by law enforcement. As a result, a group of activists decided to challenge the verdict. Under mounting public pressure, Paul's lawyer filed an appeal, and the court agreed to release him on bail. This was a rare decision, but the intense public interest in the case allowed Paul to leave prison. However, there was a serious issue: bail was set at $500,000. To raise such a large sum, Paul's family had to sell their home. As part of their continued efforts to prove his innocence, Paul's lawyer demanded a new DNA analysis of the biological material found on the victim's underwear. Earlier attempts to test this sample had been unsuccessful because the available forensic methods were too primitive to provide a clear genetic profile. By the mid-1990s, technological advancements allowed for a new examination. The results were clear: the DNA in the semen sample did not belong to Paul. This revelation caused a major stir in Canadian society. Paul had spent 1.5 years in prison and, after his release, spent several more years in courtrooms, which completely devastated his life. All of this had resulted from the actions of police officers who, instead of seeking genuine evidence, had tried only to align the available information with their preconceived belief that Paul was guilty. In January 1995, 10 years after Christine's body was discovered, all charges against Paul were finally dropped, and he became a free man. Later, Paul sued the authorities and was awarded compensation of $1,200,000. Some individuals involved in the investigation were accused of fabricating evidence against him and faced criminal proceedings themselves. Moreover, this case led to some of the most significant reforms in Canadian legal history, aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. Following Paul's release, authorities decided to reopen the investigation into Christine's murder and assembled a new team of detectives. Now equipped with a DNA sample from the real perpetrator, they focused on collecting genetic material from everyone who could theoretically have been involved in the crime. Samples were collected from several hundred men, but none matched the profile. Since then, no major breakthroughs occurred in the investigation. The case was transferred to the Cold Case Division, where it was periodically re-examined, but no new suspects were identified. The primary issue was that the original investigative team had lost some evidence and failed to conduct a thorough investigation. They had been so convinced of Paul's guilt that they never seriously considered other potential suspects. Canadian media continued to publicize the case, and after one of the major articles was published, journalists received several interesting tips. At least 3 individuals pointed to potential suspects. One man claimed that his father had confessed to killing Christine before his death. Others identified people with bad reputations who had lived in Queensville at the time. Journalists passed this information to the police, but none of these leads could be linked to the murder. In 2019, 35 years after the murder, the investigation was reopened once again, and the case was assigned to a new detective. Since the only concrete lead was the perpetrator's DNA, he decided to attempt identification through genetic genealogy. At the time, no companies in Canada specialized in such complex research, so the detective had to collaborate with an American firm and obtain permission from his superiors to fund the process. Eventually, he secured the necessary funding, and experts began searching for the perpetrator's relatives in public DNA databases. They identified several distant relatives, but thoroughly analyzing their family trees could take years. Specialists compared data about these individuals, which helped narrow the search. Ultimately, they concluded that to find the perpetrator, the police needed to examine the genealogical trees of approximately 400 people. With this information, the detective contacted a Canadian colleague experienced in DNA research. This colleague agreed to assist with the investigation and, along with his team, began reconstructing the family trees of those individuals. However, he chose not to share any specific details with the detective to avoid unintentionally forming incorrect hypotheses or premature conclusions. His specialists worked on this task for 8 months, meticulously analyzing various family lines until they eventually narrowed the search down to one particular family. The family's ancestor was a man born in 1804, and experts carefully traced the lives of his numerous descendants. In October 2020, they identified a specific family and one name that matched all the criteria: Calvin Hoover. When the detective heard the name, it was unfamiliar to him. It had not appeared in any case files or among the thousands of leads collected over more than 3 decades. However, while investigating Hoover's background, the detective uncovered a surprising detail: Hoover had been one of Christine's family's closest friends. At the time of the murder, he was 28 years old and lived in Queensville with his wife and children. Christine's parents had been friends with his family for years, and Hoover had even been listed as their emergency contact. Moreover, just a few days before the tragedy, Christine's mother had visited Hoover's home. During their conversation, she told Hoover's wife that she planned to visit her husband in prison with their son after a trip to the dentist, but she wouldn't be taking Christine along, believing she was too young for such a visit. This way, Hoover's wife knew that the girl would be home alone at a specific time, and since Calvin was also home at the time, he could have overheard this conversation. Additionally, Christine knew Calvin well, so she might have followed him without hesitation or willingly gotten into his car. After all, he was a trusted friend of her parents. The detective began to wonder why Hoover's name hadn't appeared in the case files despite his close connection to Christine's family. That's when he uncovered another interesting detail. It turned out that at the time, officers had only spoken with Hoover's wife, who claimed that she wasn't home when Christine disappeared. She added that her husband had been taking care of their young children at the time. Based on this information, the officers decided there was no need to question Hoover himself. They accepted his wife's statement as his alibi. As a result, Hoover had the opportunity to commit the crime, and all the detective needed was to confirm his guilt. However, a major problem arose. Hoover had passed away in 2015 due to severe health problems. The detective, now in need of a DNA sample, began considering his next steps. In cases like this, the body is not always examined in detail, and even if it had been preserved for testing, after 5 years, there was a chance that no usable biological material would remain for DNA analysis. Fortunately, when the detective contacted the forensic doctors who had examined Hoover's body, he learned that 2 vials of Hoover's blood had been stored in the medical examiner's archive. These were sent to a laboratory, where experts extracted a DNA sample and compared it to the genetic profile of the murderer. The result was undeniable, a perfect match. Hoover was confirmed as Christine's killer. Christine's parents were devastated by the news. Throughout all those years, it had never crossed their minds that Hoover could have been the perpetrator. They were deeply disappointed that Hoover had lived out his days surrounded by family, never facing justice for what he had done. His relatives were also shocked and the police informed them of the discovery. His wife stated that it had never once occurred to her that her husband could have been involved in Christine's disappearance. Paul, on the other hand, told reporters that finding the real murderer didn't change much for him. He had spent nearly 10 years between prison and courtrooms, and even after being cleared of the charges, many people still believed he was a killer. He added that for years afterward, he lived in constant fear, a fear that still hadn't left him to this day. He concluded by saying that this case had destroyed not only Christine's life but also his own. Thank you for watching. Share your thoughts about this story in the comments, and don't forget to leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and stay safe.